When this mask on, I can't see my pocket to adjust my thing, my microphone, so bear with me on that. We're going to talk this morning about Joesph the Carpenter, the man who taught Jesus. I want to, first of all, put this in perspective to God's eternal purpose. I've mentioned many times for those here, and I hope you don't get tired of hearing it, but for the purposes of the live stream and the recording, Genesis 3:15 is the thematic statement of the Bible. God's eternal purpose is to bruise the head of the serpent through Jesus, and he has done that. The Bible records God's actions in bringing to pass that eternal purpose. In bruising the head of the serpent, he provides salvation for all mankind. In Daniel chapter 5, or Daniel chapter 2 rather, Nebuchadnezzar had a dream, and in this dream, Daniel interpreted it as representing 4 successive kingdoms: the Babylonian, Medo-Persian, and Grecian, and Roman. And each of these kingdoms had a role in the providence of God in bringing about the fulfillment of his eternal purpose. The Babylonians, they took the Jews into captivity, and as a result, synagogues were scattered throughout that realm, which was later to become eventually the Roman Empire. So that when the gospel was revealed and the apostles and others went out to preach, there would be locales throughout the empire where there would be a people who would be interested in the Messiah, and they would go there and use these as their central locations in preaching. So the Babylonians, synagogue. The Medo-Persians, they allowed the Jews to come back to Jerusalem so they could maintain their identity as a people. Now, they never were a kingdom again in the fullest sense of that word. They never had a Davidic king after the deportation to Babylon. Now, it is true that Rome set up a king, Herod the Great, but he was not a Davidic king. He did not rule by God's authority. He was a puppet king. And so the Medo-Persians, they allowed him to come back. The Grecians, they provided a language that was very easily became a worldwide language, universal language. And this is the language in which the New Testament was written. This is the language in which the Hebrew Scriptures had been translated some 100 or 200 years before Christ. And when the apostles and others quoted Scripture, they almost always quoted from the Septuagint, which is simply the name for the Greek translation of the Old Testament. Septuagint meaning 70, the 70 Jewish scholars who so translated it. And so the Greeks, the language. The Romans, 2 things that the Romans provided mainly. That was the peace that existed throughout the Roman Empire and the roads that led everywhere. Rome built roads everywhere, and so it has come to be said, and I've heard it many times over the years, all roads lead to Rome because Rome built roads everywhere, and travel was made easy, but by virtue of the peace and the road system that they developed. All things were coming to a head during the Roman Empire, the 4th kingdom. They knew that the kingdom was getting closer, drawing near. And then we have 2 individuals, Joseph and Mary, both of whom were descended from David. And they are betrothed to one another. And so with Joseph and Mary, the eternal purpose began to unfold as far as the actions were concerned. When God chose to send his Son into the world, he entrusted the priceless gift in the hands of a young couple from Nazareth in Galilee. While history has been lavish in its recognition of Mary, Joesph has been largely passed over. But many valuable lessons, I believe, can be learned from a study of this noble individual's life. Joesph possessed qualities that enhanced submission. I heard a series of lessons years ago on the eldership, and that's how it was titled, Qualities that Enhance Submission. I believe when men show or demonstrate the qualities that are the qualifications of an elder, that enhances submission, and it doesn't just demand, but commands submission, and causes submission to be a natural outgrowth of this kind of a man, or these kinds of men becoming elders in a local congregation. And Joesph had these qualities. And we're going to talk about some of those this morning. Some of the qualities that Joesph had. First of all, Joesph was humble. That is a quality that all men should demonstrate. Humility. He was a very humble man. He was of royal blood. And somebody said, well, that didn't contribute to his humility, did it? Well, in a sense, it did. He was the descendant of Abraham through David, as I've already mentioned. In Matthew chapter 1, beginning in verse 6, and David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah, and Solomon the father of Rehoboam, and Rehoboam the father of Abijah, and Abijah the father of Asaph, and Asaph the father of Jehoshaphat, and Jehoshaphat the father of Joram, Joram the father of Uzziah, and Uzziah the father of Jotham, and Jotham the father of Ahaz, and Ahaz the father of Hezekiah, Hezekiah the father of Manasseh, Manasseh the father of Amos, and Amos the father of Josiah, and Josiah the father of Jeconiah and his brothers at the time of the deportation of Babylon. Now Jeconiah, let me just stop and say this, was the last Davidic king to reign by God's authority. He was deposed by the Babylonian king, and one of his brothers was put in his place, which did not continue to life, because his son should have been king after him. But his brother became king. And after the deportation to Babylon, Jeconiah was the father of Shealtiel, and Shealtiel the father of Zerubbabel, and Zerubbabel the father of Abiad, and Abiad the father of Eliakim, and Eliakim the father of Azor. Now these men never served as kings, but this was the line of succession from David through these men. And Azor the father of Zadok, and Zadok the father of Achim, and Achim the father of Eliab, and the father of Eleazar, and Eleazar the father of Mathan, and Mathan the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called Christ. So we can see that Joesph was a direct descendant of David through Solomon, and as such had a right to sit on the throne of David, which in effect was the throne of God, because God authorized David and his successors to sit on that throne over Israel. Israel didn't have a king at this particular time. Herod died, and his kingdom was split up, and there were 4 governors taking over the various 4 portions of the kingdom over which Herod the Great ruled, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And so Joesph was of royal blood, and yet he was humble. What contributed to his humility? Well, first of all, he was from Nazareth. Nazareth, located in northern Palestine, some 65 miles from Jerusalem, and some 15 miles from both the Sea of Galilee and the Mediterranean Sea, had a population of around 15 to 20,000, generally considered to be an insignificant town. And so when, in John chapter 1, when Philip, one of the earlier apostles of Jesus, went to tell Nathanael, we have found Jesus of Nazareth, the Messiah, Nathanael's response was, can anything good come out of Nazareth? Nazareth was not a well thought of city. They surely thought that the Messiah would come out of Jerusalem, the most important city, the capital city of Palestine. So it's insignificant and not well thought of. But in Luke chapter 2, verses 1 through 5, we see this. In those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. This was the first registration when Quirinius was governor of Syria. And all went to be registered, each to his own town. And Joseph also went up from Galilee, from the town of Nazareth to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem. That's where David was from. And so Joseph, while he lived in Nazareth, his ancestor David was from Bethlehem, so Bethlehem was called the city of David. And that's where he had to go to register. Because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be registered with Mary, his betrothed, who was with child. But when Herod died, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, Rise, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead. And he rose and took the child and his mother and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in place of his father Herod, Herod the Great had died, and the kingdom again was divided into 4 tetrarchies. Tetrarch is a ruler over a fourth. And so 4 kingdoms, or 4 parts of the kingdom, 4 rulers. Tetrarch, basically equivalent to governor. And so Archelaus was just as mean as his dad was. So when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And being warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee. Now, this is where Matthew introduces Nazareth. But as we see from Luke, he lived in Nazareth before he went to Bethlehem and before he went to Egypt. But when he comes back to Egypt, his first thought is to go to Bethlehem, but he doesn't want to go there because Archelaus is over Judea, and he's just as bad as his daddy. Remember, his daddy tried to kill Jesus, and he killed a bunch of children, 2 years and younger, to make sure that he got Jesus. But Jesus was down in Egypt because God knew the plans of Herod the Great. So Archelaus is reigning, so he goes to Galilee. And he went and lived in a city called Nazareth, so that what was spoken by the prophets might be fulfilled, that he would be called a Nazarene. Now, no prophecy that I've been able to find said that Messiah would be called a Nazarene. But in Isaiah chapter 9, we do learn that the Messiah his ministry would begin in Galilee. The name Galilee is not used, but that was the area where Zebulun and Naphtali were, 2 of the brothers of Judah. That was where they lived, their families lived at the time of Isaiah. And this came to be known as Galilee. And so it was prophesied that Jesus would come from this region, which again was an insignificant region and was not thought of very highly. In Luke 3, verse 1, in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate, being governor of Judea, at some point Archelaus died. Rather than giving him another tetrarch who was a Jew, or a Hasmonean, which is what Herod the Great was, they put a Roman in there, Pontius Pilate, governor of Judea, and so now the tetrarchy included 3 descendants of Herod the Great and Pharaoh and Pontius Pilate. And Herod being tetrarch of Galilee, and his brother Philip, tetrarch of the region of Iturea and Trachonitis, and Licinius, tetrarch of Abilene. Normally you've got 4 tetrarchs, but one of the tetrarchs was either died or deposed by Rome, and Pontius Pilate put in his stead. And so again, what was one kingdom under Herod the Great is now 4 tetrarchies under these 4 men. So he was from Nazareth. Now, being from an insignificant town, he was an humble man. He didn't have much to be proud of as far as where he was from was concerned. Not that he would have been proud. I think we're going to see that a little bit. And he was poor. he was not a wealthy man. In Luke 2 verse 7, and she gave birth to her firstborn son, and wrapped him in swaddling clothes, and laid him in a manger, because there was no place for them in an inn. The inn would be a place where they would be, that would be very inexpensive, but they didn't have room, and they didn't have money for any other place. And so she gave birth probably in a stable. Stable's never mentioned, but that's where you find mangers. And so they laid him in a manger. And so again, we got humility in the birth of Jesus because of the poverty of his parents. In verse 22 of Luke 2, and when the time came for their purification, the purification of Joseph and Mary, according to the law of Moses, they brought him to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord, as it is written in the law of the Lord, every male who first opens the womb shall be called holy to the Lord. Now, they have probably stayed in Bethlehem during this time, rather than go back to Nazareth only to return to Jerusalem after 40 days. So they've been out of Nazareth probably at least 40 days, and whatever time it took to make the trip originally. But 40 days after the birth, they had this responsibility. Every male who first opens the womb shall be called holy to the Lord, and to offer a sacrifice according to what is said in the law of the Lord, a pair of turtle doves or 2 young pigeons. Now notice in Leviticus chapter 12, we see that portion of the law that demanded this. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the people of Israel, saying, if a woman conceives and bears a male child, then she shall be unclean 7 days, as at the time of her menstruation. She shall be unclean. That is ceremonial unclean. Doesn't mean she's sinful. Doesn't mean anything like that. Only she's just, we can understand this a little more these days, self-quarantined. And not to go out for 7 days. And on the 8th day, the flesh of his foreskin, the male child, shall be circumcised. Then she shall continue for 33 days in the blood of her purifying, that is, in her self-containment. She shall not touch anything holy, nor come into the sanctuary until the days of her purifying are completed. And so, 7 days, circumcision, then another 33 days to end this period. But if she bears a female child, then she shall be unclean 2 weeks, as in her menstruation, and she shall continue in the blood of her purifying for 66 days. And so a little longer. And when the days of her purifying are completed, whether for a son or for a daughter, she shall bring to the priest at the entrance of the tent of meeting a lamb a year old for a burnt offering, and a pigeon or a turtle dove for a sin offering. So 2 offerings. One is a burnt offering, the other is a sin offering. Sin offering, again, doesn't mean that she's sinned, only that's everybody sins. And so here we've got this period of time, and a sin offering needs to be offered. And he shall offer it before the Lord and make atonement for her, the priest. Then shall she be called clean from the flow of her blood. This is the law for her who bears a child, either male or female. Here's the important part. And if she cannot afford a lamb, then she shall take 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons, one for a burnt offering, the other also a sin offering. So, if you can't afford a lamb, use another turtle dove or a pigeon. And the priest shall make atonement for her, and she shall be clean. And so we know from these circumstances they were poor. They could not afford a lamb for her purification ceremony. So he was humble for these reasons. Though he was descended from David, he was in the city of Nazareth, and he was a poor man. He wasn't wealthy at all. Couldn't afford a lamb. So he's very humble. But not only that, he was holy. He was taught the Shema. Now, the Bible doesn't specifically say this, but we know from historical records and Old Testament records that every male child was taught the Shema. The Shema is Deuteronomy 6, verse 4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. That's the Shema. As a boy, he would have been taught the Shema, This title comes from the transliteration of the imperative form of the verb hear. Imperative simply means it's a command. This is a command. Hear. Listen. Be aware. Keep this in mind is the idea. That's the Shema. And what they were to hear, what they were to listen to, what they were to keep in mind is that the Lord our God, the Lord is one. That was the Shema. And according to sources, every Jewish boy learned this at age 4. They were to then memorize large portions of the Old Testament. And so he was almost certainly taught the Shema. Secondly, he attended synagogue. Now again, we're not told this, but by virtue of the fact that he was the way he was, and the other characteristics that follow, we know. He had to have been one who was in attendance at the synagogue. Keep in mind that God entrusted this man to teach the Son of God. And so surely he would have chosen a man who would have lived an exemplary life, and this is one of the things that's involved in an exemplary life in that time. So again, while it's not specifically stated, he was surely regular in attendance at the synagogue services, which consisted of the recitation of the Shema, Deuteronomy 6:4, prayers, scripture readings, preaching, and a benediction. That's where we got basically the pattern for the local church services. Because that's pretty much the things that we do, although the Lord's Supper has been added to that as a memorial to what Jesus ordained. So he almost certainly attended synagogue. He was a just man, which is another translation of the same word translated righteous. In Matthew 1:18 beginning, now the birth of Jesus Christ took place in this way. When his mother Mary had been betrothed to Joseph, before they came together, she was found to be with child from the Holy Spirit. And her husband Joseph, being a just man and unwilling to put her to shame, resolved to divorce her quietly. We can understand that his first thought was, she has been unfaithful. And during this betrothal period, they did not even have a right to one another's bodies, much less to the body of anybody else. They would remain pure, set apart to one another, but unable to enjoy the privileges of marriage. But they had the responsibilities of marriage. He thinks she's been unfaithful, but he's not going to make a big deal out of it. He's not going to make her a public spectacle. He's going to divorce her quietly. But as he considered these things, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream, saying, Joseph, son of David, do not fear to take Mary as your wife. For that which is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will bear a son, and you shall call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had spoken to the prophet, by the prophet. It quotes Isaiah. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which means God with us, which is the equivalent of Jesus, which is Yahweh saves. When Joseph woke from his sleep, he did as the angel of the Lord commanded him. He took his wife, but knew her not until she had given birth to a son, and he called his name Jesus. And at the end of 8 days, when he was circumcised, he was called Jesus, the name given by the angel, before he was conceived by the woman. Now keep in mind the different approaches that Matthew and Luke take to the birth of Jesus Christ. Luke goes from the description of the visits of the angel to Zacharias and Mary to the birth of John first, and then the birth of Jesus. Matthew just mentions the birth of Jesus in a cursory way in chapter 1, and then talks about the visit of the wise men in chapter 2. The visit of the wise men is at least 40 days after the birth of Jesus, because they had gold, they would have sold that and bought a lamb, because they would have been required to do so. And so they named him Jesus. And again, 2 turtle doves and 2 pigeons, one for a burnt offering, the other for a sin offering. So he was a holy man. But also he was an honorable man. He worked hard to provide for his family. He was a carpenter by trade, so he was an industrious individual. An honorable man is a man who is industrious. A man who is not industrious is not an honorable man. Now, if a man can't work or can't find work, that's another matter. But an able-bodied man who refuses to work is not an honorable man. In Matthew 13:55, is not this the carpenter's son, speaking of Jesus? Is not his mother called Mary, nor not his brothers, James and Joseph and Simon and Judas? So that's not, they knew Jesus there in Galilee, especially in Nazareth. They knew he was the son of Joesph the Carpenter. Now, 2 Thessalonians 3, verse 10, for even when we were with you, Paul said, we would give you this command, if anyone is not willing to work, let him not eat. And so again, a man able-bodied man who refuses to work is dishonorable. He's not worthy to be supported. Now, there are all kinds of reasons why. There are reasons why the Thessalonians in particular needed to hear that, but we won't go into them now. So he was industrious. Also, he was an honorable husband. Betrothed to Mary, in those days, engagement was as permanent as marriage. He understood marriage to be the only honorable way for a man and a woman to live together. In Hebrews 13, verse 4, let marriage be held in honor among all, and let the marriage bed be undefiled, for God will judge the sexually immoral and adulterous. And so Joseph wanted a chaste, pure bride for a wife, because he was aware of these commands, and he was honorable. When they had departed, that is the three wise, however many there were, the wise men, just so easy to be caught up in culture and tradition. When they, the wise men, departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, rise, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him. And he rose and took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt, and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son. When God called Israel, his first son, out of Egypt, that was prophetically mentioned in retrospect. But God here, through Matthew, is using that as a typical prophecy, a prophetic type of calling Jesus out of Egypt. And so we see these parallels here. He was an honorable husband. He was also an honorable father. He raised Jesus as one of his own. He and Mary had at least 6 other children, as we've talked about already. Well, we only talked about 5. Jesus and his 4 brothers. We'll mention the other 2 tomorrow. He apparently taught Jesus also to be a carpenter. He earned the respect of the Son of God. In Mark 6, verse 3, is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary and brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us? And they took offense at him. So he had 4 brothers that are named and at least 2 sisters. Now they would have been half brothers because they would have had Joseph as their father, which he was only the legal father of Jesus. He would be the natural father of these others. But they would have raised these 2 together. And I'm confident that Joseph, the way he is described here, would have shown no partiality, but would have treated them all the same. And he went down with them, Jesus did, and came to Nazareth and was submissive to them. And his mother treasured up all these things in her heart. So Joseph was such an honorable father that Jesus himself, the Son of God, was submissive to him. He had respect for him. He obeyed him. He allowed him to teach him the art of, or the art of carpentry. And so he was a very honorable father. But he was also heroic. Now every child needs a hero. And should find his hero or heroes at home or in the church. I tell you what, it's sad. When children will know more about some of these football players and basketball players and baseball players and quote statistics right and left, but they can't tell you the names of the 12 apostles. They can't tell you the names of the books of the Bible. I believe parents have a responsibility to emphasize the need to have spiritual heroes. A father should be the greatest hero of a son. Not because the father says, I'm your hero, but because of the character of the father, it should be impossible for the son not to look at him with respect and consider him to be heroic. Parents, preachers, elders, and Bible class teachers should be the heroes of our children. What does a hero look like? A hero is not necessarily someone who accomplishes some great feat in sports or gets an Academy Award or a Golden Globe Award or even a People's Choice Award for something that they accomplished in film or television. But a true hero is one who accomplishes much in the spiritual realm. Now, Jesus, first of all, Joseph, had backbone. Now, there's a difference between backbone and jawbone. Now, a lot of people with a jawbone, they think they've got backbone. A person with backbone doesn't need to speak out often. He doesn't need to speak loudly. He just needs to speak firmly, assertively. He needs to be firm in his decisions to the extent he is the decision maker. If he's the husband and father, then certainly his word ought to be the last word. If he's one of the elders, then with the other elders, they ought to speak authoritatively and firmly. They don't need to raise their voices. The preachers do because they want to make sure their voice is carried to the back pew. Not because they're angry or anything like that. But by backbone, I mean moral fiber. He stood for what was right, not just for his rights. Now, when he wanted to put Mary away privately, yes, that was his right as he understood the situation. But when he understood the situation properly, he realized what was right was not just what he had the right to do. What was right was for him to take Jesus into the family and raise him as his own son, and that is what he did. He had backbone. He was good-tempered. The events surrounding the conception and birth of Jesus do not seem to have upset him. He seemed to take everything in stride, though it took a revelation from God to ease his mind about Mary's pregnancy. And again, the first thing you think is not, she must have conceived by the Holy Spirit. But when that was conveyed to him by God in a dream, then he accepted that. So he was good-tempered. Also, he was moral. We see that by virtue of the moral education he obviously gave to Jesus and his children. Now, his other sons did not accept Jesus as a Messiah until after the resurrection. But after the resurrection, they did. At least we're told that two who did, James and John. Or James and Jude. We don't really know about the other three. But James and Jude are specifically mentioned. Well, all of them are mentioned in Acts chapter 1. Just not by name. But James and Jude were used as prophets of God to write each one a separate inspired epistle. The book of James, written by one of his brothers and half-brothers. And the book of Jude by one of the other half-brothers. And so he was a moral man. And he had to be a moral man to accomplish the things that he did and to be the kind of hero we know he was to Jesus and his other children. He was respectable. He was well respected of. Nothing bad is ever said about Joseph. Matter of fact, about the only thing that's said about him is what we've already read in Matthew chapter 1 and in Matthew 2 and Luke 2 and Matthew 13:55, which identifies him as a carpenter. You know, carpentry is a respectable, honorable occupation. And again, he had to have been respectable, to have been chosen by God to raise Jesus. He was adaptable. He certainly adapted himself to this situation. When he was espoused to Mary, and it's hard to say when that espousal took place, whether it was during their after they were raised or before they were raised. Sometimes marriages were arranged early in their lives. But as time grew near, I'm sure he did not expect to be raising a child that was not literally, physically his. But he adapted to that situation. And just as Mary said, I'm the handmaid of the Lord, he said, I'm the man, basically, and took that responsibility upon himself. He was cooperative. He cooperated with God in this. Now, God never leaves anything to chance. Somebody said, and I think I said this back in 1984 when I preached it the first time. What if Joseph did? But there was no way, because God chose him. God knew what kind of a man he was and what kind of a man he would be, what kind of a parent he would be. God doesn't leave things to chance. And think about it, God knows everything. And he picked the ideal couple. Again, both of them descended from David through different sons. Joseph through Solomon, and Mary through Nathan, another of David's son. He cooperated with the will of God, as certainly she did. He was courageous. It took a lot of courage to do the things that he did. It took a lot of courage for him to leave Bethlehem and go down to Egypt. As far as we know, never been down there before. It took a lot of courage for him to come back. Even to go to Nazareth, because there was still the chance that Archelaus might have influence up there, even though he did not reign up there. He was loyal to God, loyal to his wife, loyal to his children. He was a loyal individual. He was obedient. He obeyed God in this respect. He did what God told him to do. He was dependable. God depended on him, and he followed through on God's dependence on him. And again, I don't mean dependent in the sense that God could not have done it some other way, but God depended upon him to do to fulfill the role God had instituted for him, the role God had chosen him for. Just like God depends on us to be faithful children of God. And we must follow through on that. He was reverent. That is, he was religious. He was revered by people, and by Jesus in particular, by his wife and by his other children. He was sincere, not a dishonest bone in his body. There's no indication he ever was dishonest with himself, much less with others. He was, even when he was going to put away Mary, he was sincere in that because of what he thought mistakenly, which again is understandable. But when he realized what was going on, he changed his mind on that. He was spiritual, again attending the synagogues on a regular basis, which he almost certainly did. He was unselfish. He treated, for all intents and purposes, as far as the scripture, he treated Jesus just like one of his own. Remember when Jesus was down there in the temple? Joseph and Mary were both concerned about him. At age 12, maybe they forgot for a moment who he was. And it's difficult to understand completely how much Jesus had emptied himself as he came to earth. But I'm sure they were just as concerned about him as they would have been any of the other children that they had. But they were unselfish in that. They went down and dealt with that situation. And Joseph, by the way, he allowed Mary to deal with it. No indication that Joseph said anything to him at all. But he was unselfish in doing all that. He was patient in the way that he conducted himself through all this. He was disciplined. He was steadfast. He was law-abiding. He was tenacious. He had a stick-to-itiveness. And he was exemplary. Through the example of Joseph, we learn that poverty is no hindrance to the service of God. Somebody says, well, I can't do anything. I don't have any money to do it. Well, you can do what you can do. You can afford to do something. Everybody can afford to be a good example. And he was. He learned he learned to respect the sanctity of scriptural marriage and to be a person of integrity and dependability. He learned to labor working with his hands, that which is good, Ephesians 4:28, and to trust in the Lord with all his heart, not leaning upon his own understanding, Proverbs 3 and verse 5. He was disciplined. He was steadfast. He was law-abiding. I guess I went over all those. He seems to have died. Joseph seems to have died prior to Jesus' 30th year. Since there's no mention of him being present during any of the events recorded during the ministry of Jesus. He's mentioned, but never in a way that shows that he was still alive, much less present. Jesus on the cross committed his mother into the care of the disciple he loved, which is almost certainly John. So Joseph was dead by then, but he left an indelible mark in the world by having raised the Son of God alongside of Mary. If you need to make your heart right with God, the song that has been chosen is 646, just a little talk with Jesus. Of course, it takes more than prayer, but we must have a praying attitude, and we must come to God in humility of heart and seek Him to obey His commands. Won't you come, folks? Stand and sing.